One of the most encouraging practices that I have undertaken in the last couple of weeks, and it's some of the most encouragement I've had in 2024, is joining Refuge KC for their daily prayer meetings and enjoying time virtually from 6:45 to 7 a.m. with other believers and interceding for Muslims in various places. Each day we begin with a profile of an individual or a family in a Muslim-dominated country across the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and an individual's real story and what they go through. And it has reminded me and encouraged me that Christianity is global. It's not just about me. It's not just about my interactions here. It's much larger than that. And it's reminded me of the difficulties that are common for believers in many places and the kinds of circumstances that they endure. And tonight, I want to think with you about the encouragement that we get in the historical account of Jesus' death, and thinking about the forces that are opposed to Jesus here, and thinking seriously about these provides us encouragement because God's sovereignty over these events is explicit in the text, Jesus' knowledge of these events, and all of this for us. And it reminds us and encourages us that the factors and the individuals that might seem against us are not outside of God's control. God knows about them, and His plans will carry on. This theme of the power of the kingdom and God's plan carrying on is a part of what we'll be encouraged by tonight. But as I stated already, it also explains the very real need for the brand of Christianity common to everyone being a basin and towel. The argument goes something like this. If we pick it up at John 13 with the foot washing and we progress through the end of the Gospels, we're looking at John, but we could look at any of them. You need to have an attitude of love to one another because there is so much against you. You need to have an attitude of mutual encouragement, and that's the brand that you need to identify with in your footsteps of life, not just on a hat or a sweatshirt, but who you are, because you are going to need one another. And that's exemplified immediately here in the forces that oppose Jesus. I want to look at the circumstances around Jesus' death. I want to do so in somewhat of a character study. Here's our plan. We're going to look at John 18 and 19, not every verse, in a broad perspective of the sequence of events, and think of these as snapshots. And I want you to think of these as snapshots of individuals and their coordinated actions. We'll begin with thinking about two individuals, Judas and Peter. Judas, greedy and a betrayer. Peter, fearful and acting cowardly. Different in their eternal spiritual states, yet both coming against Jesus. And yet that's part of the plan. Second, we will look at a few other individuals. We'll look at two high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, and then Pilate. Here we have this coordination of Jewish and Roman political leaders, and they are coming against Jesus. And what is fascinating is in interacting with both of them, Jesus is obviously in control. He's almost waiting on them to catch up with him in all that's going on, even though they think they're in charge. And here we have conspiracy, and we have the one who will crucify Jesus ultimately and give the verdict, Pilate. And yet, this is all a part of God's plan. Even this kind of opposition. And this glorifies Jesus. And then we want to think about two other individuals at the grave, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. And here we have two individuals who represent in some ways, the fulfillment of what is stated in loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving one another, the mission idea of John that is percolating underneath the surface all the way through, rising up here in Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and their courage to go and get Jesus' body. Here they're going public. And here's God's glory in these two individuals. And they are obviously loving Jesus. And their activities in a coordinated way. In fact, if we allow ourselves to step back and look at the whole social scene, they in fact love one another in how they're acting together. Because these two individuals, both Jews, going public to identify with Jesus, they're putting each other in harm's way. And therefore, they have to have one another's back. This is it. This could be it for us. Let's begin chapter 18. God used people who acted in greed and cowardice. Those two actors, Judas in greed and Peter in cowardice. And again, this is encouraging for us. This is God using this. Now, do you notice the outline that is there before you? The first word is God used. God's doing this. It's not an accident. This is God doing this, and He is using Judas. He is using Peter as a part of this whole scenario. In chapter 18, in verse 1, we're familiar with the scene if we've read John's gospel before. Jesus is in a place that He had met with His disciples before, and it's there in this garden area that you can see Jerusalem, and you can see the eastern gate, and you can see it from a distance. And Jesus is there, and that gate would open up, and it's night, and there are torches that would come out with this whole group of soldiers, and they walk down a long pathway, and Judas is leading them out. Jesus is there with His disciples, and He could watch them coming. He could see it all happening. The disciples may not have known all that's going on, but Judas is just watching, or Jesus just watching in slow motion as these guys make their way down. And they come right to Jesus, and He's there. There's the temple police are, verse 3, with Judas. These are professional killers. These are people who don't put up with much, and they are ready for Jesus. And Jesus, verse 4, notice the text, knowing everything that was about to happen to Him. He goes and greets them. He doesn't run. There's a far distance where the lanterns would have been seen, and He could have headed to hide in the caves, headed to the wilderness, gotten away, and He didn't. He goes to greet them. It's not just that He knew. He embraced the mission that He came for. And He asked them the question, who is it you're looking for? Jesus the Nazarene. I am He. Judas, who betrayed Him, was standing there, and He told them, I am He. They stepped back and fell to the ground. It's these professional soldiers fall back at Jesus' power and authority. It is a supernatural display of Jesus' power here. Jesus asks them again, as they're perhaps getting up. This time, no supernatural power. He's displayed what He could do, and He will withhold it now. I told you, verse 8, I am He. So if you're looking for Me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the words that He had said, I have not lost one of those you have given Me. Speaking in prayer to the Father. And Peter, here's his first act of cowardice. Judas, we understand in the context of the last few chapters, is greedy. He has turned Jesus over. He has led these soldiers out for money that they are going to pay him. Peter here begins to act in somewhat of a cowardly way. Though it seems on the surface he's protecting Jesus, he's actually protecting himself. He's not necessarily protecting Jesus. Would Jesus need to be protected if He just speaks and they all fall back? It doesn't seem like he would. It's much more about Himself. Verse 11, Jesus says so straightway, sheath your sword. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given Me? And God is over all of this. Jesus is walking right into it. We're looking at verses 1 through 27 here and thinking about this this greed and cowardice. Now, there's a bit of overlap in these verses in terms of thinking all the way to verse 27. The next few verses intertwine what's going on with Annas and then Caiaphas, these high priests that we'll look at in a moment. But there's this connection with Judas and then Peter. Just progress with me in the text to verse 15. Just focus on Peter in this sort of character study. We've looked at Judas, the one who betrays, and Peter's initial cowardice. And in verse 15, we pick it up again. This is Peter's denial. Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest. So he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter remained standing outside the door. So the other disciple, the one who known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was at the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Then that slave girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" The idea of two there implies that she understands who is one. She already knows John is, and it doesn't seem to be a problem, but you too? And this, again, points to Jesus' prophecy that, Peter, you're going to deny me. This is Peter's actions, and Jesus knows all about it. It's under God's sovereignty. His failure is not unknown. There are two disciples of Jesus here going into the high priest's quarters. John, and he's not denying, and it doesn't seem to be any threat to him, and Peter. But Peter, when asked, is cowardly. I'm not, verse 17. The slaves and the temple police had made a charcoal fire standing outside. They're standing there warming themselves, and Peter was with them. If we progress down to verse 25, Simon Peter, warming himself, "You aren't one of these disciples too, are you?" "I'm not." One of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. The connections here are so rich. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" And Peter denied it again. Through verse 27, we have two characters, one greedy, one cowardly, both acting according to the plan that Jesus said they would fulfill. And this is the opposition that comes. In our lives, there are situations where there's opposition from individuals. We're trying to make a testimony for the gospel at work, in our families, and there's opposition. And we have to recognize God's sovereignty over these who would oppose us. We have to think about the fact that if anything seems inappropriate and should have been stopped, it's this. And it's continuing on. And this is a frame that goes all the way through the Gospels. If we look at Peter's life later, when the Spirit comes and he's bold in his testimony, we could look at the other apostles. We could look at Paul and the change in his life and those who would oppose him. He would readily recognize God's sovereign over those who would oppose. And when we think about John's Gospel in the whole series of John's writings, and we land in Revelation, and we land in Revelation chapter 6, the breaking of that sixth seal, and these who have been martyred, how long until you do justice? And it's told to them, the full number of those like you is not complete. God knows all those who are going to oppose us. He knows the opposition that will come from individuals, and this encourages us. God used people who acted in greed and cowardice, and it's the same in our lives. There are people who are greedy, who are cowardly, who would oppose us, and God will use them. God uses them today just as He did then. It may be the case that just as you think this through, individuals might be coming to your mind, and it might be helpful just to pray for them as we progress even through the text and turn our attention to those who acted with conspiracy and contempt. These, in our larger frame, when we think about conspiracy and contempt, Annas and Caiaphas and Pilate, we turn our attention not to maybe individuals that we know personally, but those who we know from a distance. Political actors, larger organizations. That's Annas and Caiaphas and Pilate. They're not maybe folks we would know, but we would now turn our attention to praying for those in authority who would oppose, because that's Annas and Caiaphas. Pick up the text with me in verse 12. Chapter 18 and verse 12. We've hinted at the place of these individuals last week in looking at the resurrection of Lazarus at the end of chapter 11 when the Sanhedrin is called together, because when Lazarus comes out, many go to the Jews, including those like Annas and Caiaphas and others in the Sanhedrin, and they report what Jesus has done, and it's a great threat that the Jewish leadership feels. And some of those, especially most threatened, are Annas and Caiaphas. Verse 12 of John 18. The company of soldiers, the commander, the Jewish temple police arrested Jesus and tied him up. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Annas was high priest from the year 6 to the year 15. From about 6 to about 15, he's high priest, and he has great authority over the Sanhedrin and the people. Again, Rome lets the Jewish leaders, so long as they keep the peace, keep the taxes flowing, they have a lot of freedom, and they're in charge. This is Annas from 6 to 15. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, becomes high priest in the year 18 through the year 27. If you're doing the math, that's 6 to 27, that's 21 years where these two individuals are, for the most part, running the Sanhedrin and in charge of things. And they are going to come together against Jesus because he's threatening them. And this helps us also understand Pilate, because Pilate doesn't become governor until the year 26. In the whole organizational structure of the ancient world, Pilate is sort of a Johnny-come-lately. That's why he feels so threatened by the Jewish leadership and what they are stirring up the crowds to do. This is the larger scale opposition. If Judas and Peter are the small scale individual opposition, we have names of Annas and Caiaphas and Pilate, but they're larger scale opposition. And what's fascinating is Jesus' posture toward them is exactly as it is to Judas and in some ways Peter. It's exactly the same. Notice with me in the text, verse 19, if we pick it up, the interplay with Peter having been recognized already. Verse 19, the high priest, this is Annas, questions Jesus. And Jesus, I've spoken openly. I've always taught in the synagogue and the temple complex where all the Jews congregate. I haven't spoken anything in secret. I do it all publicly. Why do you question me? Notice Jesus' boldness. Question those who heard me. If you want testimony, listen to people. Ask them what I said. They know what I said. End of verse 21. Jesus is slapped by the temple police for his boldness. If I've spoken wrongly, give evidence. But if rightly, why do you hit me? Jesus feels no threat in this sense. Having had his time, Annas moves forward and sends Jesus on to Caiaphas. Then to Pilate. Pick it up with me in verse 28 of chapter 18. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early in the morning. And now we progress from Jewish opposition to Roman, and Jesus' posture is exactly the same. These men, notice verse 28, they did not enter the headquarters themselves, otherwise they would have been defiled and unable to eat the Passover. Here's one of John's themes about the Jewishness and the rituals and the history of Judaism. They're maintaining these ideas, but there's another factor that we need to keep in mind. In this sentence, John sort of wraps up what he's going to say for a moment about the Jewish leadership. They're not going in is religious, it's also political. So long as they maintain their religious posture, they demonstrate faithfulness to their political position. These are two sides of the same coin. By not going in, they demonstrate faithfulness to their Jewishness, which Rome has allowed. And if they would compromise this, Pilate could question them. They're maintaining it. They're showing that they are in charge. Their staying out will be a part of what they're ironically doing to force Pilate to do what they want. Pilate came out to them. What charge? Notice Pilate has to come out to them. This is part of the whole social structure. For the Sanhedrin, religion is politics and politics is religion. They are intertwined and they cannot be separated. It's not oil and water. It's all mixed up. Pilate has to come out to them. What charge do you bring against this man? They answered, if this man weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. Think back to John chapter 12 that we looked at last week when, these people want to make him king. That's right, what a good idea. That would be a good idea. So Pilate said, take him. You judge him according to your law. It's not legal for us to put anyone to death, the Jews declared. They said this so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, saying what sort of death he was going to die. Verse 32 again underscores Jesus knows this. He's predicted it. This is exactly on target. He's sovereign over the larger movements. These actors, whether religious or political in an immediate perspective, though bound together, are not outside of God's sovereignty. This is encouragement for us in our day. They said this, verse 32, John's application, so that Jesus' words might be fulfilled, signifying by what sort of death he was going to die. One historian writes about the Jewish leadership that's handing Jesus over to Pilate. Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes were influential on many different levels of society in different ways at different times. What they all had in common during Jesus' day was that they operated within a system of social power that could be manipulated in their favor. If Jesus was to engage the power structures of his day, he would have had to have contended with these groups. Indeed, this is the portrait that provided by the Gospels. It was the manipulation of power for their advantage. And how does John interpret this? Verse 32. What is being looked at as their advantage is actually not outside of God's providence for the death of Jesus. This is encouragement for you and me when we think about the broader structures of society that might oppose the gospel and might oppose us. Those broader structures might be political, might be media institutions, might be just cultural in kind of a vague, blended way. God is not surprised, and He is sovereign over those forces even that oppose us. It's no excuse for them, but even their scheming for their advantage will not win ultimately. The actors of Good Friday, be it Judas or Peter, Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate, the actors here, the portraits that we are seeing remind us that God is sovereign over the advance of His kingdom. And if He, Jesus, is over and over stating that this is happening according to plan, brothers and sisters, you and I can take courage today in 2024 because no political force is outside of God's sovereign plan. He is over them. They are under Him. It becomes apparent in this with Jesus' interaction with Pilate. If we ever need a text that heartens us and steels our spines when the larger structures of society would seem against us, when they put us in the bullseye and we feel great pressure from them, do not forget Jesus' words to Pilate. Don't forget the humanness of our opponents. That's another way to say it. They're human. They have a heartbeat. They have an issue date and an end date. And because of Sunday, you don't. Notice the text. Pilate went back into the headquarters and summoned Jesus. Here we have one-on-one. Are you the king of the Jews? Are you asking on your own, or have others told you about me? I'm not a Jew. Your nation, verse 35, and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done? Here's, if you have a red letter Bible, these are just so precious. Verse 36 and 37. My kingdom is not of this world, Jesus said. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. As it is, my kingdom does not have its origin here. Brothers and sisters, take courage. What you are participating in is larger in scope and structure than the societal forces that oppose you. It's larger. It began before the United States. It began before Russia or China or these national entities. It began before whatever media company you don't like today. It might be different tomorrow. It's bigger. We are called to more than what we see. My kingdom's not of this world. And if Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, he's speaking about people, what does that say about you and me? This is not home. We are not of this world. My kingdom does not have its origin here. You are a king then? You say I am a king, and look at this. Look at Jesus. I think this is said with a smile. I think Jesus was pretty tough. I think he was, obviously his trade would make him physically, but I think here you say I'm a king? I was born for this. I've come into the world for this. I've come into the world. If you come into the world, that means at one point you were not in the world. At one point you were, but you were not here. I've come into the world for this, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Truth in the New Testament and John's kinds of writings is, it's hard sometimes to define. It's nebulous. It can move here and there, but it nearly always deals with Jesus' incarnation and his presence. That's truth. It's reality. It's something that can be touched. That's why 1 John begins so tactile. What we have seen, what we have heard, what we have handled concerning the word of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm real. I'm real, and there's real access to God. So these actors, again, are not outside of Jesus' sovereignty. Conspiracy and contempt. The conspiracy of the Jewish leadership conspiring against Jesus. And what we have here in verse 38, this is Pilate in a phrase, and what I'm suggesting summarizes it is contempt. He has contempt for Jesus. Jesus is inconvenient to Pilate. Pilate has enough on his plate. He doesn't really like his job, but it's better than other jobs he could get. He doesn't like the Jews. He's sick of them. And now he's got this guy. During Passover, all these people around. Contempt, verse 38. What is truth? Just contempt for all this. What is truth? And the economy of the text. Jesus interacts with Pilate here in a few moments as we progress into chapter 19, verse 1. Pilate has Jesus flogged, and again, he's just trying to get rid of this thing, not do a crucifixion, just get rid of him. The soldiers put a crown of thorns on his head, and the soldiers are now mocking him, making sport of him. Hail, King of the Jews, they say. Pilate brings him outside. Look, I'm bringing him outside to let you know I find no grounds for charging him. Now Pilate's contempt is against the Jews who brought him. I'm done with this. I'm done with you, Jesus. I'm done. I have no charge. Just let him. Jesus came out wearing the purple crown. Here's the man, Pilate said. And the chief priests and the temple police saw him. Now the temple police are under the chief priest's authority. That's their sway. They're all crying, crucify him. Pilate, again, his contempt. Just take him. I fight, just be done. Done with this. Get away from it. When Pilate hears that Jesus is not just king but Son of God, he brings Jesus back in, has further dialogue, but now Jesus, verse 9, says, now Jesus goes silent. And that only brings more contempt in Pilate's mind. And here, Jesus' statement in verse 11 takes us exactly back to his statement in verses 36 and 37 of the previous chapter. And he tells, after a few moments of silence and not answering Pilate's question, notice Jesus' statement in verse 11, you'd have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given you from above. God used, when we think about Judas and Peter, greed, cowardice. Now he's using conspiracy and contempt to carry out his plan. This is why the one who handed me over to you has a greater sin. Again, Pilate's making every effort to release him. The next several verses progress pretty much the same way. Finally, Pilate has to give in. Verse 15, should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar. Because they put Pilate in their crosshairs, we have no king but Caesar, Pilate has to hand Jesus over to be crucified. By saying we have no king but Caesar publicly, they put Pilate in the point of decision. If he's making himself a king, and we're saying we have no king but Caesar, and you let someone go who says he's a king and not Caesar, you're in trouble, Pilate. Pilate, right there, has to make a decision. And the decision is to put Jesus to death. We find ourselves just at the precipice of the crucifixion. And God is over all of this. He's using it. He's not in any way surprised by what has happened. He had to do this job. David Chapman and Eckhard Schnabel have a large book profiling Pilate, the crucifixion. They note this about Pilate. The competencies Pontius Pilate had been given as prefect of Judea included the responsibility to maintain law and order. That's what he had to do, especially as far as Roman citizens were concerned. He monitored the Jewish authorities, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin. He alone had the authority to try capital cases in the province. And a part of what he was now forced to do was to crucify Jesus. Even though he had contempt for the whole situation, because the Jews made this statement, he has to crucify him. And God's working through it all. Verse 16 of chapter 19, they took Jesus away, carrying his own cross. He went to the place of the skull, and they crucified him there with two others. And Jesus had this inscription put over his head, Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. He's there crucified, and in that position is where he looks upon his mother, likely John the Apostle in verses 26 and 27, and provides for his mother there. And then, as we read earlier, Jesus knew that everything was accomplished. Verse 28, the scripture fulfilled, and he said, I'm thirsty. They fixed this sponge, and then, verse 30, Jesus received the sour wine and said, it is finished, and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. There he died. His death was, in some senses, brought about by a series of human actors. Judas especially. Peter didn't contribute to the death, but you see his cowardice. You see him as one of the main actors in the whole series of events. Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate directly involved. Conspiracy and contempt both operating here. In all of this, Jesus' statements, my kingdom's not of this world. You would have no authority of me over it all. Sheath your sword, all the way coming back to those soldiers. Who is it you're looking for? He is sovereign over all of this. As we partake of the Lord's Supper this evening, as we grab our cracker and cup, we're mindful that the structures of our lives, the individuals we might know, the larger forces we might not know personally, but we know they know us, are not outside of God's control. God is sovereign over media today. God is sovereign over politics. He is sovereign over those who might oppose us. Our response is to remember Jesus' authority and that his kingdom is not of this world. We don't have an end date. We will pass away, but that is the beginning because of what we celebrate Sunday. As we open up the cellophane there and grab hold of that cracker, we remember that this cracker represents a broken body that was healed. And that body still exists. We recognize that our bodies might be broken as well, and we are getting new ones. Let's eat in remembrance of Christ. As you open up the juice, taking off the foil, we remember Jesus' blood poured out for us. We remember even John the Baptist in chapter 1 of John. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The forces that oppose you could never take away your forgiveness. The individuals who oppose you, the societal forces, across the globe, across centuries, they can do nothing to inhibit forgiveness of sin. That's the power of this blood. Let's drink in remembrance of Jesus. We've noticed a few individuals, and I've tried to frame the activities of these individuals in reference to God's sovereignty. God used Judas. God used Annas and Caiaphas and Pilate so that Jesus would be crucified. For us, for forgiveness of sin, God used it all. And God is working today in our world and the difficulties that we face. But there are two more actors that we need to see. This brief character study of these individuals here in John 18 and 19 ends with John 19, verses 38 to 42. When we began John's Gospel, if you were with us several weeks ago and did an overview, and we landed here thinking especially about Nicodemus and his role and his courage, and Joseph of Arimathea as well. Once we get here in our whole study, I think it'll really help, but I think along the way you're pretty close. This is remarkable. Listen, this is where John's going the whole way through. I think he has on the back of his mind as he reflects on his time with Jesus, he reflects on all that happened. He's probably read some of the other Gospels and thought conversations with the other apostles, and I was putting this together. Listen, the New Testament is a literary gem. And just the way it's written, the ideas coordinated together, it's not happenstance. And John's own gospel that way, and the themes, the way it works out. Along the way, early on, we have these cowardly kinds of figures and statements about night and Jesus knowing people, and they're trying to hide in their sin or not going public. And now we have these heroic acts of Joseph and Jesus. And notice verse 38, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, that is going to stand so brightly after John 12, when so many signs Jesus has done and the people don't believe. Because they're afraid of the Jews. That's why they're afraid of man. And here, God's glory has been expressed on the cross, and already we have a change. We have courage in these men. He's a disciple of Jesus. Friends, in the whole of John's Gospel, that is a phrase that is rare. There are many who are afraid. And now, after Jesus is crucified, at the moment when their testimony is most costly, Joseph goes public. At the moment of greatest threat, Joseph goes public. But secretly, he says, his public act was that way until this moment. He asked Pilate to remove Jesus' body, and Pilate gave him permission. He took the body down. He had been private. Now he's going public. And Nicodemus the same. They took Jesus' body, wrapped it in linen cloths, aromatic spices, according to the burial custom of the Jews, and this garden where he was crucified, there was a new tomb, and Jesus' body is placed there. And these men, costly 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Andreas Kostenberg and Alexander Stewart bring the idea together of Joseph going public. Had been secret, now at the moment of greatest threat, he goes public. Joseph of Arimathea, they write, asked Pilate for permission to bury Jesus' body. His request to bury Jesus required a good deal of courage, since it makes his sympathy for Jesus public at a time when such sympathy could be dangerous. Nicodemus assists Joseph in the burial by providing approximately 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes to wrap the body in linen, an extravagant gesture indicating the high esteem in which Nicodemus held Jesus. There, at the moment of greatest threat, is when Joseph changes from private to public, identifying, here is God's glory. This is the encouragement of Good Friday, these last two actors who are public in identifying with Jesus. May we be the same. Would you join me as we pray? Lord, we pray that you would encourage us, embolden us to go public, to identify with you. Give us courage, wisdom, and let us be a people who have one another's back in going public, not solo, but as Joseph and Nicodemus coordinated, let us love one another in support of identifying with Jesus and the movement that began in his death. We ask in